What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why I am building in the unproven phase and why I believe that is leverage that is only going to 10x into the future. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how I'm scaling those mental models into the future so that we can ultimately build better and scale efficiently as possible. And also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and be the chief problem solvers that ultimately build backend infrastructure off of that creates insane amounts of value. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively building for, which is killing chaos, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this one is going to be a super fun one. I'm super excited to speak about this, about how, my personal beliefs on how I'm actively building in the unproven phase and why this is going to be super dialed in into the future and why this is only just going to create insane amounts of leverage. So most people wait until they're proven to build in public. I'm not. I'm taking the most opposite route to say, hey, I'm actively just going to build and I'm going to show my thought process, how I'm thinking about things, how I'm actively solving for things before, we get that validation, if you say, and saying, hey, I'm doing the opposite because early stage isn't weakness. I'm not looking at this early stage, even though I like to have this mindset of saying, hey, each and every single day I'm still in the early phase. It always keeps me hungry because it allows me to then say, hey, I need to actively just learn as much as I possibly can and never take that high horse approach of saying, hey, I know each and every single thing, because that is not true. To say, hey, I'm actively learning as much as possible, and where I'm at in the early, quote unquote early phases is not a weakness, but it's leverage hiding in plain sight. And saying, hey, it's leverage ultimately saying, hey, I'm building what I'm building, but I'm documenting the thought process, how I'm actively building in the unproven phase, if you will, which is ultimately just going to allow us to then 10x what we're going to be doing in the proven phase once we reach the proven phase. And saying, hey, this isn't a growth hack. It's not, just a simple growth hack to say, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. This is what we're going to be doing. Growth is hard, at least from my experience. It's hard. It takes time, but it's ultimately worth it in the end. And that is ultimately what is going to happen into the future. And I'm super bullish that, if we just keep hitting the nail in the wall, we're going to get there. But ultimately, to get there, we ultimately just need to, build and, in the unproven phase and just keep on going. That validation will come when the time comes, but we actively just need to make sure that we're implementing strategic visibility and also creating an unfair permanent advantage and a permanent unfair advantage. Ultimately saying, hey, each and every single day we're going to document, we're going to build what it is that we're building inside Killer Chaos OS, but we ultimately just going to hit the nail in the wall by making these videos, because these videos are ultimately just going to be the foundation of the way that we're thinking about things and how we're going to be scaling those into the future. And saying, hey, let me show you how I'm building belief before validation. So the big picture vision for this that I would like to just talk about is authority before proof, and ultimately saying, hey, proof is downstream from clarity. Ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're clear in what it is that we're doing in terms of what it is that we also want to achieve and the big picture vision for what we have Killer Chaos OS to be. And ultimately proof is going to be a downstream effect to that. It's going to be downstream. It's going to be something that is ultimately going to become, that's ultimately going to come as a result of that clarity that we do build. And saying, hey, most founders chase validation first. I chase vision, clarity, and build publicly. I ultimately build publicly to say, hey, each and every single day I'm actively going to chase what it is that we're doing in terms of that vision, that clear vision, and then ultimately just building publicly to say, hey, I'm not perfect, I'm still a long way, but we're ultimately just going to share what it is that we're thinking about, how we're thinking about certain things, and how we're going to scale what we're going to be thinking about into the future. And why? It's because what I think, how I move, and how I attract before product market fit is going to be super important into the future. This is just my personal belief, and saying, hey, this is the origin story people remember and the narrative mode most ignore. Saying, hey, in the foundation phase there's so much leverage to be built, and that's just my own personal belief to say, hey, right now we could be helping out so many people because there are going to be so many builders and operators into the future that are going to need some kind of springboard. And what cooler way or what best way could we do it by just building these videos and sharing them each and every single day and saying, hey, we're gonna just build our authority and say, hey, each and every single day we're gonna build what it is that we're doing, how we're failing, and how we're gonna be scaling that into the future, which is ultimately just gonna build the authority, and then the proof comes as a downstream to that. But ultimately, it just begins with action, and ultimately just starting with Killer Chaos OS and saying, hey, Killer Chaos OS isn't just being built, it's being believed into existence. My personal belief to say, hey, I believe and the team believes that Killer Chaos OS is going to look like this down in the couple years, but ultimately, in order to understand that, we have to believe it into existence. And I'm super bullish on this to say, hey, we know what we want Killer Chaos OS to be, and we're just gonna actively just build towards that and saying, hey, we're gonna build it. We don't need authority. I mean, we don't need validation. We don't need to say, hey, this is gonna work, this is gonna work. Let's just build it and then figure it out from there. And saying, hey, we're ultimately always gonna just figure it out, and having that mindset is ultimately just gonna allow us to scale what we do inside Killer Chaos OS, how we plug it in into businesses into the future, how we ultimately just gonna refine. But the big picture vision ultimately leads to us starting from now and saying, hey, let's build our authority before the proof, and actively just build that and saying, hey, I'm always going to take this mindset of saying, hey, I need to always be the lifelong learner and say I'm always in the early phase mentally, even if I'm not, to say, hey, I'm in the early phase, but ultimately this is going to guide what it is that we're going to be doing inside Killer Chaos OS into the future. And saying, hey, how I am building before I'm proven, ultimately this is now the strategic side of things that I'm actively thinking about, to say, hey, here's how I'm architecting, here's the architecture of how I'm thinking about it, and this is going to be just ultimately sharing how I'm actively thinking about, how I am building before I'm proven, quote unquote, and then actively saying, hey, this is when we're going to be doing into the future. But number one starts with documenting thinking over features. I think one of the most important things, and this is something I've tried to translate within these videos, is to document the way that I think through things and the way that we're actively, thinking through certain things in terms of how we're building our Killer Chaos OS, how we're actively doing in our day-to-day operations, how we see the future as well, because I believe that this is going to be super important, because thinking is the product in the early stage. So basically asking, what is the product if you're just beginning? I think, for me at least, I believe that the thinking is going to be the product of what it is that we're going to be doing into the future, because that ultimately leads to the other things that come with it, to say, hey, we're going to get clients because they ultimately understand how we think, how we're actively solving for things, and also just scaling that into the future. And saying, hey, I break down logic flows, I break down what's behind the logic flows, UX, and even false starts, ultimately saying, hey, I'm breaking down how we're actively thinking about logic flows, client acquisitions, UI, UX, how we're thinking about design, how we're integrating in, how we're implementing design, how we're integrating design in what it is that we're building inside Killer Chaos OS, and ultimately how we're going to be scaling that into the future, to basically just document how I'm actively thinking about this and how we're actively thinking about this, so that into the future this becomes part of our permanent real estate that we can always go back to and say, hey, in XYZ, we got these specific nuggets that ultimately allowed us to change Killer Chaos OS into the beast that it's going to be. But ultimately, documenting that, or documenting the way that we're thinking through things and the way that we're solving for it, is ultimately going to be the mode that's going to drive what it is that we're going to be doing into the future. So I'm super excited about that as well, and ultimately saying, hey, we need to get super tactical and tactical in these videos, to say, hey, let's document our thinking, our high level thinking, how we can actively scale better and build better into the future. But I know that these are just solely just going to be springboards for what it is that we're going to be doing in the future, but focusing more on how we're thinking over features, on saying, hey, we implementing this feature that notifies our client 2 weeks that they need to pay for their team member. Ultimately saying, hey, that's not super important, let's just focus on how we're thinking, because our thinking is gonna create a lot of different avenues for us to play with. And saying, hey, this also ultimately attracts collaborators, mentors, and buyers before the UI is even stable. Ultimately saying, hey, if someone is super fond of our thinking and the way that we're thinking through things, they're gonna be like, hey, they know what they're talking about, and we want to ultimately be the ones that are that are most knowledgeable about what it is that we're doing from a first principles basis, and then ultimately build around that and saying, hey, each and every single day I'm thinking as if I'm a beginner, but ultimately that mindset is only going to be super super predominant in terms of learning, and saying, hey, I need to learn each and every single day like I'm just starting my first day, building systems, of which it's not, but ultimately just driving that, that mindset of this is the beginning and I just need to make sure that I'm grasping as much as I possibly can. I know into the future is ultimately just going to scale what it is that we're going to be doing inside Killer Chaos OS. So an example of this, that how we're thinking, could be saying, hey, here's why I killed this Zapier loop. So basically showing the thinking of why this is, because it ultimately led to an increase in latency. Saying, hey, this is why I killed it, and this is my thought process or the mental models I was using in terms of why we got rid of this specific step, how we killed this loop, and how we bettered it into the future, what we used as a substitute for that. Because I know the way that we're documenting thinking and the way that I'm actively just thinking through things is ultimately just going to build Killer Chaos OS into this thinking machine that ultimately becomes this intelligence ops, which is something that we're now just super super bullish and super dialed in terms of building, and saying, hey, building the mythos in public, ultimately saying what it is that I actively believe in, what it is that I'm also just building at the moment. And this is day 54, so ultimately saying, hey, this is not just for me, but it's for memory formation. Ultimately saying, hey, we need to form the memory of what it is that we're doing, how we're thinking about things, how we're actively using the things that we believe in now to build what we're building now, and how we're going to scale that into the future. And saying, hey, mythos compounds faster than traction. Ultimately, what are the set of beliefs that I have within Killer Chaos OS that we're actively scaling, and how does that play into the future, and how can we use that as a compounding asset in order to build traction into the future, to say, hey, we're going to be using this as a compound feature, but ultimately it's going to move faster than traction, but ultimately as a downstream to that, we're going to have traction. So if you get what I mean, you get what I mean. And then saying, hey, people want to follow momentum in motion, ultimately saying, hey, they want to focus on something that is within momentum in motion, something that is already moving, and not necessarily a polished case study. Because right now we're still in the trenches, we're still learning a lot, and I think that is going to be super relatable to a lot of builders now, and also builders into the future. And I think this is going to be the moat that is ultimately just going to make us relatable, and also just making sure that into the future we look back and we're like, hey, if you want to learn from me, or you want to learn from my mistakes of what it is that I did in the past, and also how I actively implemented the different ways to think about things in the future, just watch these videos, which is going to be super helpful, I know, into the future. And ultimately just believing it into existence, of saying, hey, Killer Chaos OS, we're going to turn it into this massive beast, but ultimately we just need to be able to build the proof, and we ultimately need to build the authority and then build the proof. But ultimately, just hitting the nail in the wall is the most important thing. And saying, hey, this isn't marketing, it's pre-legitimacy narrative stacking. Ultimately saying, hey, I want to stack as much narrative to it, and we want to leverage that, and we ultimately just want to scale what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS, which ultimately leads to the third point, which is anchor in vision market fit, which is super important as well, to say, hey, most people chase product market fit before belief traction. We want to do the opposite. We want to focus on building the belief traction and then chasing product market fit, because saying, hey, I lead with the why, the fire behind Killer Chaos OS, because that fire or that why that builds Killer Chaos OS, people resonate with that a lot more. And saying, hey, because people buy the reason before they buy the thing. Buying the reason why it is that we're building Killer Chaos OS, and then they buy what the thing is. Ultimately saying, hey, well, from my experiences, at least I've learned that, hey, people buy the reason, what it is that you're actively doing, and then they buy the thing. So basically you can think about this to say, hey, why do people buy luxury brands? The reason is because it makes increases your status. Your status is increased. So what do you need to do? You ultimately just buy the thing. Why do you need to buy a Rolex watch? You need to also ultimately increase your status, which then results in you buying the thing. Even fashion, for example, like high-end fashion. At least that's the way I think about it. And saying, hey, we kill chaos because not because it's convenient, but because it's killing planners margins silently, ultimately saying, hey, into the future we know that Killer Chaos OS is going to be playing a massive role in terms of killing silent killers. And ultimately, how we're going to do that, we're ultimately going to say, hey, the reason is, we build because we're killing Chaos OS, because we're killing chaos, and then ultimately the reason or the why, the thing, it would ultimately be Killer Chaos OS. And then ultimately saying, hey, I move like we've already won, ultimately saying, hey, I need to make sure that we believe that we've already won, acting, saying, hey, Killer Chaos OS is already this. And I'm sure if you've read, Think and Grow Rich from Napoleon Hill, you get a lot of insight into this, to move like you've already won, and then the thing happens, which is super important. And I know that, it sounds super cliche, but I do believe that, Killer Chaos OS is going to get to where we want to get it, and where we want to make it get to, and saying, hey, I post Killer Chaos OS like it's already in the top 5% of op stacks, because I believe that one day we will be in the top 5%, in terms of op stacks, and that we will get, super high. We may not hit 5%, but if we get 10% or 15, top 15%, at least we would have landed somewhere, still super high ranking. And that is super important. And why? Because confidence scales faster than code. Ultimately saying, hey, within your mind, you ultimately understand, if you read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, you ultimately understand that every single thing starts in the mind. Once you have confidence in what it is that you're building, and also just, saying, hey, we have the belief that Killer Chaos OS is ultimately going to shape the future, but ultimately how we're going to shape that future needs to be data backed as well. Saying, hey, we also need to understand that we're building the confidence, which scales faster than code, because one of the things is we're going to build confidence in terms of building Killer Chaos OS, how we're thinking about building it into the future, and also just scaling it as well. And then saying, hey, energy precedes credibility, saying, hey, ultimately the energy in what it is that we have is ultimately going to precede the credibility that we're going to have, to say, hey, we need to be energy focused, energy first, and then credibility based, ultimately saying, hey, we just want to do right. We ultimately want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, and that we're actively enabling businesses to scale, and also just solve where the bottlenecks are within their business infrastructure. And then saying, hey, I act like I'm already onboarding 5 clients next week, because eventually we will be. Ultimately saying, hey, let's plant the seed in our mind, then it will come into fruition. This has happened so many times, I cannot, stress to say, hey, I believed something was gonna happen, and then it didn't happen. It didn't happen like in the real world in that specific moment in time. But later down the line, it manifested itself in different aspects, which is super crazy, because that is such a powerful concept to say, hey, if we move like Killer Chaos OS is already in the top 1%, ultimately that vision, or that we start attracting the things that ultimately lead us to there. But that is not enough. Simply just also pushing the needle and taking daily actionables, and just being super obsessed in building Killer Chaos OS is ultimately going to get us there. Not just focusing on vanity metrics and saying, hey, I track signal metrics, not vanity, which is going to be super important as well. Saying, hey, instead of waiting for ARR, I track measure signals, basically saying, hey, these are the traction signals that I'm measuring, which are planet convos, failed flows turned into learnings, how we're actively learning in terms of the failed flows that we have, DM replies, micro referrals, how many people are we getting through referrals. These ultimately shape the product and prove it's alive. Ultimately saying, hey, Killer Chaos OS is alive simply because it ultimately is this living, breathing machine that we're collecting data off of, which is going to be super important, because data is going to be the number one driver of what it is that we're going to be doing in terms of decisions. Data backed decisions are going to play such a key role. And saying, hey, we don't need case studies to validate motion. We just need movement that's measurable. Also, just ultimately just tracking the movement that is measurable, which ultimately leads us to understanding why this matters. Which, if anything, if I were to break down anything within this, I think it just comes down to 3 main things of why this ultimately matters. And it's saying, hey, building in the unproven phase gives me 3 timeless advantages. And these ones I solely do believe in, and I know that they're going to ultimately just push the boundaries of what it is that we're going to be doing into the future. Of saying, hey, it creates a narrative gravity, ultimately understanding that people root for what they've watched grow, how it is we're in the trenches right now, ultimately just, being relatable, to say, hey, we're in the trenches, we have good days, we have bad days, and that's okay. And ultimately, we're just growing and we're actively building along with the journey, and using these videos as, a part of our documentation of how it is that I'm building Killer Chaos OS and how we want it to be in the future. And also, just saying, hey, people root for what they've seen grow, to say, hey, I knew they were always going to build Killer Chaos OS into this beast because they spoke about it in the beginning. And saying, hey, it also unlocks, asymmetrical feedback, to say, hey, I get intel from planners or just people within the industry while I'm building, not after, which is super important, to saying, hey, each and every single day that we're building, we're actively just getting those data points that are going to drive our decisions, not after, to say, hey, we've built the thing, now we're getting feedback, but let's get feedback while we're building, and saying, hey, this is asymmetrical feedback that is ultimately going to guide Killer Chaos OS into what it is that we're actively going to be doing into the future. And then saying, hey, this is also builds reputation equity, which I think is going to be super important into the future, to say, hey, when the product hits, they'll say, hey, I saw this coming. Like I said, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're building, and ultimately, if it works out, when it works out, we ultimately, just have that, reputation equity in terms of saying, hey, I knew they were going to win. But ultimately, to get there, we just need to keep hitting the nail in the wall, keep doing what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and just keep believing and saying, hey, this is the long-term game, and this is going to be our Chaos Killer advantage. What it is that we're going to be using into the future. Like I said, this is just my take on it. We're ultimately just going to keep refining, hitting the nail in the wall. We're going to fail so many times, and we're also going to just succeed so many times. But ultimately, it starts here. It ultimately just starts by building these springboards, ultimately understanding, sharpening our clarity, and ultimately just pushing the needle of what it is that I think, Killer Chaos OS will be into the future. But ultimately, it's going to be a fun ride. We're going to fail so many times, but I'm super excited. I'm super pumped, to be building Killer Chaos OS into the beast that it's going to be into the future, solving hard problems, and, creating insane amounts of value for our clients and future, our referrals, collaborators, partners that we're going to be working with. So yeah, I'm super excited, and I'm just super excited to keep hitting the nail in the wall each and every single day, building with the team, and also just building myself, sharpening clarity through these videos, which is super exciting. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, comments, make sure to leave some on YouTube, or even just connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. They're all in the description. And if you guys have any more questions, just pop me a message. Feel free to hit me up. And if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.